Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start just because I don't want to lose time. It's only 1 hour, and it's really it's going to be really tough. So thank you very much for being here. I'm Francesca Caferri. I work for La Repubblica, and I cover Saudi Arabia. And here with me is Iyad El-Baghdadi. Is a fellow from Civita, but is one of the most well-known Arab activists. He's a friend of Jamal Khashoggi, and is very much involved in his work. Ghosh from Bloomberg, and Margherita Stancati is the Saudi Arabia correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. I don't want to be too long, so I will just start with a brief introduction about what happened on October 2018 in Istanbul, just to say that the killing of a journalist that day was not an isolated incident in the broader picture of what was going on in Saudi Arabia. There was like the peak, the most dramatic moment of something that had started a couple of years before, actually in 2015, when Salman became the king of Saudi Arabia, and his son, Mohammed bin Salman, became more and more prominent until when he became the crown prince. This is the first time in the history of Saudi Arabia that we have a crown prince who is around 30. Usually the leadership of this country, on average, is between 70. They are usually 70, 80s, or something like that. Why do I say it's not an isolated incident? Because in September 2017, hundreds of people have been jailed in Saudi Arabia, liberal, dissidents, conservative, everybody was against Mohammed bin Salman. Then in November, there was another big round of arrests, maybe even more dramatic, because Mohammed bin Salman had 200 people arrested and brought to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh. And these were members of the royal family or former government people, maybe really the leadership of the country. In May 2018, he had arrested the leading activists of the country, the female activists who had been fighting to have the ban against women driving removed. And this happened only 3 weeks before the lifting of the ban itself. In between all of this, the Prime Minister of Lebanon was officially invited to Saudi Arabia, arrived in Saudi Arabia, and was forced to resign from his position. So this is just to say that then in October the 2nd, Jamal Khashoggi enters into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and he gets killed. So just to say that this killing is part of a trend, of something that was already going on in Saudi Arabia. I want to start with Margherita, and I want to start with a little personal story. I remember very well that day we were exchanging messages, and I just wrote you, what the fuck are they doing? What do they think they're going to do? Leave him there for 1 week, 1 month? And I don't remember if it was me and you at a certain point. One of us said maybe they're going to put him in a luggage and bring him back to Riyadh, something like that. This is just to tell you how incredible this story is. Nobody, even people like me and Margherita, who follow Saudi Arabia quite closely, would have expected what really happened that day. So Margherita is usually, she spends a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. So I would like her to explain to all of you who is Mohammed bin Salman and what's going on in Saudi Arabia. The grip that this prince has on the power is unprecedented. I mean, nobody else in this country ever had this kind of power. So, but at the same time, the country is opening. So it's a black and white picture, and maybe you can explain it to us.
Yes. So, as Francesca mentioned, what happened to Jamal Khashoggi was an aberration. It's not something that Saudi Arabia has done before, killing dissidents abroad. So how do we get to the point where the government feels emboldened enough to kill someone who they perceive as a dissident abroad in a consulate? And I think, as Francesca mentioned, we have to look at the very rapid concentration of power in the hands of the current leadership. And there's the first step, obviously, is Mohammed bin Salman was catapulted to a position of authority when his father became king. And very quickly, he emerged as the de facto decision maker in the kingdom. What we have witnessed since then is nothing short of a revolution within the House of Saud. For decades, the House of Saud, the ruling family, there was a tradition of ruling by consensus. So even within the cabinet, you had multiple princes who had a say on how to govern the country. With King Salman coming to power, what we are seeing is effectively power being concentrated within a single branch of the royal family, the Salman branch of the royal family. And that leads to the first answer of your question of how do we get to this point, is that you have fewer checks and balances in the decision-making process in Saudi Arabia today compared to even 5 years ago. So whereas before, say the crown prince, the king comes up with a policy idea, his other princes, often his brothers or cousin, were in a position to say, hey, how about this may not be the right way to address, for example, dissent. And so Mohammed bin Salman surrounded himself by yes men, all of whom were very hawkish and willing to pursue a hard line against dissent. The other important development was what happened in the US, the election of Donald Trump. When Trump became president, the Saudi government made it a priority to have close relations with the new American president. And that relationship was cultivated specifically by Mohammed bin Salman. So Trump was open to forging close ties, personal ties with Mohammed bin Salman, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was key to that. So not only was Mohammed bin Salman stronger domestically, but he also felt he had important foreign backers. And then the other development was that Mohammed bin Salman he pursued he went further than any of his predecessors to open up Saudi Arabia socially. So he took very bold action to liberalize the country socially, crucially not politically. Okay, so he had a base of support in Saudi Arabia among young urban Saudis. So he could count on his father, on young urban Saudis, and on the US. And this emboldened him to the point that he got away with so much. So for the good and for the bad. So Mohammed bin Salman, it was his decision, for example, to let women drive. For many years, even liberal Saudis would have argued, oh yes, we would love to have women drive, but the country is so conservative, there will be a huge backlash, and it will be very destabilizing for the country. Mohammed bin Salman decided to call their bluff. He pushed ahead with the policy to allow women to drive, and there was no big backlash. But he also used this authority to pursue, the most severe crackdown on any potential dissent that Saudi Arabia has seen for decades. So what we have seen is that although Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian monarchy, there existed a degree of space for public discourse. Saudis were more willing to speak publicly, whether on Twitter or in interviews or even in the media, about some of the issues in the country, for example, economic reforms, and maybe even social issues. Some Saudis were openly calling for example, lifting the ban on women driving. So there was both conservatives and liberals had some space to debate what was happening in the country. There were clear red lines, of course, and many people who were perceived as dissidents were jailed, but there was some room for debate. Under Mohammed bin Salman, he's shown zero tolerance towards any kind of independent voices. And it's not just, Jamal Khashoggi, but as Francesca mentioned, there's been several episodes preceding that. So in September 2017, hundreds of people were arrested, many of them clerics and intellectuals. Some of them were conservative clerics, but not all of them. At the time, that was kind of brushed off as, but of course he needs to arrest clerics if he wants to push through these kind of ambitious social reforms, because they will try to oppose them. Then a few months later, many rich businessmen were arrested and several princes and accused of corruption. And again, the West kind of gave Saudi Arabia a break. They were like, I'm sure they were very corrupt, and the Crown Prince is fighting against corruption, so that's great. And then there was a third wave of arrests targeting Saudi feminists, both men and women. And that happened just weeks before the government finally lifted its ban on women driving. And that became much harder to defend. And it sent a very clear message that, yes, I will bring change to the country, but I have to, the government, and specifically Mohammed Salman, will dictate the pace and direction of change. We will not tolerate anyone speak out their views, even if they align with what we're trying to do right now. So what we're seeing is these kind of parallel transformation in Saudi Arabia, where we do have a lot more social freedoms, and we'll talk more about that later, but also a shrinking space for political discourse. So political repression and greater social freedom coexisting in the same space. And there's a bit of a misconception that, once he started arresting activists, and then of course the death of Jamal showed that there were no social reforms, but actually the two things coexist. It's yes to social reforms and no to political opening. And then I just want to end by saying that I knew Jamal quite well, and one of the last times I spoke to him was in May of last year. And it was right after they arrested many of the women's rights activists who had fought for the right to drive. And at that time, he was already living in the US. We met in Washington a few weeks before that. He left because he was worried he was going to get caught in this, in this growing climate of repression. And I just want to tell you what he told me at the time. I wrote down some of his remarks. I mean, keep in mind, Jamal was a journalist, but in the past he had also been very close to the government. The first time I met him was because I wanted a Saudi perspective on foreign policy, and he gave that perspective. He was a very eloquent defender of Saudi Arabia on many occasions, and that changed under Mohammed Salman because of this increasing kind of political repression. And he was very supportive of the social freedoms that Saudis were being given because of Mohammed Salman. And so he told me this. He said, the social freedom we're experiencing is very much appreciated, but we're moving toward a complete closure. This is unprecedented and unneeded. Mohammed bin Salman is creating an opposition that he didn't have and he didn't need. And I think that's key to discussing what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is arguably his own worst enemy. There was no real political opposition in Saudi Arabia. He targeted many people that were very happy to support his reform agenda. So ultimately, yeah, he's his own worst enemy, and the fact that he got away with so much up to the killing of Jamal explains why the leadership was totally unprepared when there was this international backlash against Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the killing.
Thank you, Margherita. What I forgot to say is that the three people who are sitting next to me this afternoon, all of them knew Jamal Khashoggi personally and were working with him or were friends with him. Like Iyad. Iyad was working with Jamal at the time of his killing, but I think Iyad can explain us very, very well why in the last year Jamal Khashoggi was much more than a journalist. What did he do in the last months? Nobody really understood why he was killed. The final reason why this man was killed. I mean, there are so many ideas, so many things that may have upset Mohammed bin Salman, but the last reason, the definitive one is not really clear. So why was he much more than a journalist? What was he working on? How did his position change?
Well, thank you, Francesca. The fact is that a lot of people speculate, because Jamal was doing so many things and not just journalism. Journalism was his first identity. Whenever you asked him, who are you? What's your professional, what's your career? He would always say, I'm a journalist. That was his first identity. But he was also a bit of an entrepreneur. And a lot of that entrepreneurial element of him came out in the last year of his life. I don't think there was any single reason why he had to be killed, why MBS thought that he has to get rid of him. I think it was really a combination of all of these things that he was doing. So, as you know, or maybe that wasn't clear from the introduction, Jamal himself was at one point one of the elites of Saudi Arabia. He was one of the he was an advisor to the royalty, and he was someone who maintained his access to the highest levels of power in Saudi Arabia for a very long time. For someone like me, who is a human rights activist, this is not a normal ally. People like Jamal are not supposed to be my friends. They're not supposed to be my allies. They're not supposed to be people who sympathize with my cause. And this is the biggest thing that I think I want to portray when talking about who Jamal was. Jamal started, I mean, most of my relationship with Jamal was actually conducted online. He started following me on Twitter. We followed each other. We talked a lot. Mostly discussed, things that he was tweeting about or things that I was tweeting about. We tried to organize things before, didn't work out. It didn't work out until he went into exile, and that's when it was more possible for us to actually engage and talk more freely. But a bit about his entrepreneurship, let's say. Last year in May, I worked very hard to get him to attend an event in Oslo, the Oslo Freedom Forum. And at that time, we hung out a lot, we spoke a lot. I even interviewed him for my podcast. And at the time, I introduced him to a lot of Arab activists, a lot of other activists. Of course, there are many people who he already knew. Maybe he never met them in person, but he already knew them. And, there was some communication with them. But what struck me is how humble he is when he understood his space, his own role in such a wide movement. Because I've been in exile much longer than he has been at that point. And what he says to me is, I should not reinvent the wheel. I should not, I should actually just reach out to everyone who's outside, everybody who's working on the subject of free speech, democracy, human rights, etc. And I should, my role really should be an accelerator and a facilitator, rather than someone who, tries to take control and say that, I'm the one who you should listen to. He was not like that at all. He was like a very, very down-to-earth person. And that's where, a certain work relationship started, and that was basically escalated because he was really thinking about a very wide ecosystem. He was thinking really, how do I create a movement? How do I unite these people? How do I give support to all of these, young women and men who are doing this kind of work from outside? And as you know, Mohammed bin Salman, as was mentioned, he created his own enemy. Part of those enemies are the previous elites of Saudi Arabia, the rich people who, for every person who he put in the Ritz, there was also money that was leaving Saudi Arabia. There were people who were fleeing Saudi Arabia with their money. And what do you know? A lot of these people suddenly, they're loyal to the monarchy, but suddenly when they're in exile and, they see what happens if there's no rule of law and there's no checks and balances, suddenly they start backing democratic movements. It's mind-blowing if you think about it. But in a way, there was a lot of money. So I don't know if I would say fortunately or unfortunately, we never got any of that money. I mean, just to be clear. And Jamal was not someone who would share his sources, but he was working on a lot of things. One of the things I would mention, Francesca, he was working on is that he appreciated the role of social media in Mohammed bin Salman's power consolidation. Saudi Arabia never had a free press. Of course, I mean, Jamal Khashoggi was a Saudi journalist who worked inside Saudi Arabia long before, for decades before he ever went, became someone who writes for the Washington Post. And he appreciates more than anybody how limited the space for free speech has been in his own country. Of course, he said several times that, of course, we were never a free country, but we always had, some kind of space. But he appreciated how social media, and particularly Twitter, became an alternative public sphere, not only for Saudis, but for Arabs. Saudi Arabia has one of the world's highest penetration rates of Twitter. I think it is actually the highest penetration rate of Twitter. I think, I don't know what the figure is right now, but if you take it by percentage of the population, there are more, but there's a higher percentage of Saudis on Twitter than any other country. And this has created a situation where this created kind of a flowering of a new public sphere. If you go, I mean, a lot of people are asking, where's the public sphere? And if you go into newspapers and TV stations, etc., you will find nothing. It's basically a graveyard. But if you go to social media, you find this really, really amazing public sphere where everybody is talking to everybody, and everybody's talking about everybody. It's not always polite, it's not always nice, but everybody was represented. It was a very, very beautiful public sphere. And the funny thing is that this public sphere really flowered after the Arab Spring. I mean, it didn't exist in 2011. The Arab Spring kind of opened the door to a lot of people to start to pour into this new public sphere. So Jamal completely understood that. Jamal himself had like 1.6 million followers on Twitter, so he was an influencer himself. And he was really motivated by that because he can see that young people especially had a lot to say. They had a lot, of course, in a country like Saudi Arabia, a lot of them would not tweet in their real name. They would like try to hide their identity, etc. But one thing that he really wanted to work on is how do we, so the key here is to understand is that after the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, one of the main things he went for is people with big Twitter accounts. People who are influencers on social media. So he had to shut down this public sphere and create a new alternative public sphere which was completely dominated by him. Part of that, of course, was arresting people. Like all of those people who were arrested as early as September 2017 had big Twitter accounts as well. And I think we tabulated at some point the total Twitter, like the total following of all of these people. It's more than 50 million followers. Of course, it's not exactly unique, but it's basically a large, Twitter population, let's say. So he turned Twitter from a tool of liberation and a tool of public, free speech and expression. Mohammed bin Salman turned it into a tool for repression and a tool for McCarthyism, social control, and propaganda. Of course, he created his own propaganda empire on Twitter, so to speak. Jamal was distressed by that, and he was distressed by the fact that a lot of the people who were arrested were his friends. He spoke to me several times, especially about Issam al-Zamil, who was a young, I think he's not yet 40 years old, economist, and he had a large Twitter account himself. So a lot of the project that we're talking about is how do we revitalize this? How do we counter the propaganda efforts? How do we support voices who want to go online? Because the fact is that you can actually, the Saudi regime is a very opaque regime. And this is why I have the highest respect of journalists who try to cover Saudi Arabia. But there's always a methodological problem with that. The problem is that access is so limited. And even if you're in the country, you're not seeing the whole country. Even if you go and you want to speak to people, I mean, I remember, for example, I lived my entire life in the United Arab Emirates, which was right next door to Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates was always thought, like Saudis who wanted to escape the restrictions of their country would go and live in Dubai. But at some point, someone wanted to interview me about free speech in the UAE, and this was after my exile, and I said, why don't you speak to people in the UAE? And they said, nobody would talk to us. So it's a piece about free speech in the UAE, and you couldn't even find someone to speak to you about it. So this is a very really kind of almost dystopian kind of situation where how would you understand society? So Jamal's idea here was maybe we should look at Twitter, and maybe we could actually start engaging people on Twitter, and maybe through that, what people don't say on the street, they can say online.
Which makes a lot of sense. I mean, we could do another session on how to cover Saudi Arabia, and that would be fascinating anyway. Bobby, why did this killing have so many repercussions? I mean, this became a global story. I mean, the U.S. Congress stood up against Mohammed bin Salman. Even some Republicans who had been very supportive of Saudi Arabia suddenly changed their position. And not to mention the American press and the global press. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi somehow started, it's like a review of the global relationships towards Saudi Arabia. I'm thinking about Yemen, I'm thinking about the activists, I'm thinking about everything. I mean, it's like the impact, the perception of this country has completely changed since this killing. Why?
Well, there's several reasons. Sorry. There's several reasons why this, of all the different things that go on in the world and all the things that go on in Saudi Arabia, there's several reasons why this became the global story. And in no particular order, a very big reason was the personality of MBS himself. This happened a few months after he had done this grand road trip through the United States and Europe, introducing himself to the world in a way, and getting and saying all the right things and drawing a lot of attention to himself. Forgive me. Drawing attention to himself, presenting himself as a reformer, as the long-awaited agent of change in Saudi Arabia and perhaps in the larger Arab world. And so the fact that this happened so shortly after that itself drew a lot of attention to Jamal's murder. The second reason is where it happened, in Turkey. And the Turks, who had their own animus against the Saudis, historical as well as more recent, played the story out. Actually, you know, if you think of it from a purely propaganda point of view, they played it masterfully. They released information in dribs and drabs. They made sure the world was on the tenterhooks about what the next revelation was going to be, and they played it very well. And the fact that it happened in Turkey and didn't happen in, let's say, the Turks and Caicos. You know, if he had been murdered in the Saudi consulate in some other country, it might not have gotten this far. It would still, I think, have been a shock, but it's hard to know whether it would have, in the absence of the Turkish government playing this out, it would have been harder for the story to reach the critical mass, I think, that it did. And then, of course, Jamal was one of ours. He was a journalist. Many people in the community knew him. I met him a couple of times, including in Oslo with Iyad. Many people in the Washington journalism and political circles knew him quite intimately, had gotten to know him quite well. He had become a go-to person for anything to do with Saudi Arabia. If you were a journalist and wanted to get a perspective, you went to Jamal. If you were a businessman and you were thinking about investing in Saudi Arabia, you went to Jamal. If you were a politician, a member of parliament, a member of Congress or Senate that had a question about Saudi Arabia, you went to Jamal. He was Mr. Saudi Arabia, in a sense. So he was very well known. And finally, the Washington Post. The Washington Post made sure not only that the story got prominence, but they simply refused, to their credit, to let it go. And with the Washington Post sort of leading the charge, if you like, others in the American media also sort of went with the story, the Journal, the New York Times, and made sure that the story remained on page one for days and weeks on end. And then finally, as you said, that we could talk about cause and effect, but my feeling is because the story got a lot of traction, American politicians began to speak up about it. You know, Lindsey Graham, very, very powerful Republican, long-time supporter of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabian interests in the United States, spoke very, very candidly, unusually candidly. He talked about feeling betrayed, used language about MBS as saying this guy's off the charts. I forget the exact terminology, but language that a career politician very rarely uses. Marco Rubio. So people from both sides of the political divide in the United States seem to unite on this very unlikely issue. The fact that the White House refused to do the same actually made the story even more interesting, if you like. That you had this, what seemed to be a global consensus, what seemed to be a Washington consensus, and you had the White House that was standing apart from all of that. That gave the story another dimension, another element of drama, sort of, which I think contributed to making it such a big story around the world. And so, you know, I think in years to come in journalism schools, this will be in textbooks about how a story becomes a global, almost an obsession for such a long period of time.
I absolutely agree. I wanted to go back to Margherita, but now you mentioned the Washington Post, so I will ask Iyad first and then get back to you. The owner of the Washington Post is Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, the founder of Amazon. Last Saturday, not yesterday, 1 week ago, the head of security of Amazon published a story on the Daily Beast saying we have been investigating, we know what we did, we had a lot of time, a lot of resources, and now we can say for sure that Saudi Arabia hacked the telephone of Jeff Bezos. They are the one who stole his private selfies, pictures, and they did it to blackmail him on the Khashoggi story. So one of the sources of this story was Iyad. Iyad, can you explain us this story? I mean, how does the Khashoggi story intersect with Jeff Bezos, his telephone, his sexual life, his privacy, and everything else?
Well, Bezos, of course, is not a politician, and he's not really someone who understands the Middle East. You know, he's a businessman in the end. But he owns the Washington Post. And when he purchased the Washington Post in 2013, he made a good faith agreement that he's not going to be one of those, you know, like some owners of media, such as Murdoch, for example, is not shy about intervening into editorial policy. Bezos made a promise that he's not going to interfere at all with the coverage, and he kept it. That was a complexifier, so to speak, in Bezos' own words. Because if you're doing business with someone, and then the newspaper that you own is also, critical towards that someone, what do you do? So on February 7th, Bezos wrote a now infamous post on Medium. And he chose Medium because he could have put it in the Washington Post, but that again shows you that he doesn't want to drag the Washington Post into this. And he talked about he gave very strong. First of all, he said that I'm being blackmailed versus certain very embarrassing selfies that that basically between him and his girlfriend, and that he refused the blackmail attempt. It was a bizarre story at the time, but it immediately made sense because of certain things that we have been monitoring. Because we kind of monitor Twitter to see that Twitter is very important for our reading of for the Arab public sphere, but also of our reading of what the Saudi monarchy is thinking. So I wrote my thoughts on Twitter, and a few days later I was contacted by Bezos's investigation team, and we cooperated. Of course, I have no access to his phone. I don't have access into any forensics, but I'm able to share what I can see, and they can share what they can see, etc. So of course, as you can imagine, I cannot share everything that I know, but I can tell you a little bit more context why this happened. It happened because Bezos was one of those people who MBS met when he came to the United States on that tour in March 2018. And he met him, and Amazon was already doing a lot of business in Saudi Arabia, was thinking about doing more business in Saudi Arabia. The relationship was warm, and the relationship was mostly about business, of course. Eventually, and I don't want to get into the timeline. The timeline is a little bit complicated, but eventually, after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, all of that business talk stopped. But there was a little bit of a complicating factor. First of all, Bezos was due to appear in the so-called Davos in the desert. He was the honored guest. He was supposed to be he's not actually even on the speaker list. He was supposed to be this honored special guest, and he was supposed to declare more business with Saudi Arabia, a huge deal in Saudi Arabia. And of course, after that happened, it completely completely stopped, and he didn't make it. There was no contact, etc. That plus the fact. So first, there's the fact that this Davos in the desert was kind of it was supposed to be this great conference. He pulled out. Second of all was the fact that he did not curb the Washington Post. He did not interfere into the Washington Post's coverage, and also that the Washington Post continued to host voices that were actually very. So they hosted, for example, one of the leaders of the Houthis. The Houthis are the rebel group that Saudi Arabia is fighting in Yemen. So, they also hosted, I think they took an op-ed by Erdogan, and Erdogan, of course, at the time was, he was kind of leading the investigation, as Bobby mentioned. Turkey was leading the investigation. So MBS took it very personally, and initially he sought to pressurize Bezos. They launched basically a boycott campaign saying that you're going to boycott your company, etc. And eventually, when that didn't work, he sought to punish Bezos. We had no idea at the time what that punishment would look like, but that's why when the blackmail happened, we felt that it kind of made a sick kind of sense. And of course, when Bezos' own investigative team, of course, he's the richest man in the world and he can afford to get the best investigators in the world. And in fact, when he actually started the investigation, he said there's no budget cap. I'm not actually putting a limitation on what the budget for this investigation is. So I was actually given a very short, heads up before the article, before Gavin de Becker, who's the head of the investigation, published his findings. I myself did not, even though I was working with them for about 6 weeks, I didn't know that there was a hack. It was in my mind it was a theory, but when I was talking about it, it was a theory. But only a few hours before it came out that they told me, yes, this is our conclusion. There was a hack. And that, in fact, we have been actually watching the reaction from Saudi Arabia since then. And I believe the story is not over yet. I know that the story is bizarre for some people, but it makes a lot of sense in a sick kind of way when it comes to MBS and Saudi Arabia.
So do expect more news from Bezos and Saudi Arabia. So we only have 15 minutes left, but I want to ask one more question to Margherita and one more question to Bobby. Margherita, you were talking about social freedom. So you go to Saudi Arabia quite often. Can you try to explain to the people, because it's quite unbelievable, no? I mean, we are lucky we experience it. How did you see the country changing in the last, at the end of the day, it's 3 years?
3 years. Yeah, again, as we were talking about earlier, there's been two parallel shifts. There's been political repression, but there's also been social freedom. And I don't know how much any of you know about Saudi Arabia, but the change has been truly dramatic. The first time I went to Saudi Arabia was in December of 2015. And I'm just going to describe a little bit what life in Saudi Arabia was like then. I mean, it hasn't changed entirely, but just to give you a sense. So, first of all, in Saudi Arabia, there is a strict dress code for women. At the time, it was very strict. You have to wear an abaya, which is a head-to-toe outfit, and you should wear a headscarf. If you're not Muslim, you don't necessarily have to. There's also very strict gender segregation. So if you go to a restaurant in Saudi Arabia, even today, you go to Starbucks, you go to McDonald's, there will be a section for women and a section for men. The section for women is called the family section, and women who are accompanied by, say, their husband can go there. So men are allowed so long as they're part of the woman's family, and women on their own can go there. So there's very strict segregation of spaces. Universities, just men, just women. There's very little opportunities for Saudis to meet. The religious police at the time, Saudi Arabia has this force called the religious police, and they're basically the moral enforcers. So they will go out in public places. If they see a man and a woman talking, they can stop them and say, prove to us that you're related. If you're not, they could take you to prison. At the time, I had a Saudi colleague who's a man, and it was very stressful because we were working together, and we were often driving together. Well, Ahmed was driving because I wasn't allowed to. And we would meet in coffee shops. Clearly, we weren't married. I mean, we're always a little bit worried that the religious police could show up and arrest us just for interacting with each other. Also, there's prayer time closures. So in Saudi Arabia, every time it's prayer time, so several times a day, everything shuts down. So all shops, it can be lunchtime, and restaurants will close for prayer time. And of course, women have experienced have had a pretty tough time in Saudi Arabia. It's probably the hardest. I mean, from the point of view of the kind of laws and rules, it's no country really compares to Saudi Arabia. Women are legally second-class citizens, so they are legally minors. So they need to have a male guardian to, for example, marry or travel outside the country. So since then, there's been dramatic progress in some areas, not all. For example, women can now drive. That's the biggest change. Gender segregation still exists, but it's gradually going away. So now it's a lot easier for men and women to meet in cafes or restaurants. Some cafes or restaurants no longer have the division. The government hasn't said this rule no longer applies, but it's been kind of implicit. So increasingly, you don't have that gender segregation anymore. So men and women can meet, can talk, can even date sometimes, which is fairly new development in Saudi Arabia. And women, and since the religious police now is no longer allowed to arrest people. So a lot of the changes we're seeing now is because in 2016 the government said the religious police, you can still exists, but you can no longer arrest anyone. You can go up to people and tell them, hey, sister or brother, perhaps you should not, perhaps you should cover your head with a headscarf, or maybe go to pray, but they can no longer arrest. So that's marked a huge turning point. And now going to Saudi Arabia now it looks like a different country than it did just 3 years ago. There's music concerts happening in the country. 3 years ago, it would have been unthinkable. Music was seen as socially taboo, and still is by many in the country. Now you have concerts happening all the time, and even for Saudis, that's truly shocking. It was in 2017, I went with a Saudi friend of mine to a concert by a woman, and that's even more sensitive. The voice of a woman is considered even more immoral than just regular music. And she was stunned. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. And that was the first concert by a woman in Saudi Arabia in decades. And now you see Saudi women not wearing headscarves so much. I mean, of course, most of the country remains deeply conservative, and they choose to cover themselves. But many women who don't want to necessarily wear the full niqab don't, and often just keep their headscarves on their shoulders. And of course, women now can drive. And there's been a whole... and the public sphere has also changed dramatically. It's full of cafes. Okay, there's no alcohol in Saudi Arabia. It's banned, but you can go to coffee shops. And in coffee shops, you'll see young Saudi men and women mingling and talking to each other and listening to music, all things that really would have been unthinkable until recently.
So once again, this is to tell you that this is not a black and white picture. This is a very complicated country, and it's a big challenge for journalists to tell the story. I mean, it's like we saw a lot of reports, especially when MBS went to the States, which were totally positive, no? On Mohammed bin Salman, on his reforms. And then on the other side, we see people who have never been to Saudi Arabia and never experienced this kind of change that Margherita was talking about, just saying this is a country that belongs to the Middle Age. It is not. So again, it's black and white. That's why I was saying we could do an entire session how to cover Saudi Arabia. But we don't have time. So we have time for another question with Bobby. Margherita said before that MBS has two friends in Washington right now, only two friends. One is President Trump, and the other one is Jared Kushner. So very powerful people, unfortunately. So how do you see the future of this relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi Arabia, and maybe we didn't explain it too much because we didn't have time, it's a very important ally for the United States, and the US cannot afford to cut this relationship. What do you see in the future?
Well, look, if you're only going to have two friends in Washington, D.C., those are the two friends to have right this moment in this administration. But I don't think things are going to go back to where they were before. Whether 2 years from now or 6 years from now, there will be a different administration in Washington, and there will be talk, I can predict right now, there will be talk of a reset with Saudi Arabia. There'll be talk about that from Washington. There'll be talk about that from Riyadh. But it's never going to go back to the heady days before October last year when everyone thought that MBS was going to be the great reformer. There are too many things that have happened, not just the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but the fact that it has opened inquiries in the minds of people into other behaviors and other events, like the war in Yemen, like the arrest of the women activists, the human rights activists, and other such things. So I can't imagine that the American political establishment will go back to the relationship with Saudi Arabia. But that said, nobody, not even Lindsey Graham, not even his fiercest critics in the United States, is willing to say we need to break off relationship with Saudi Arabia. That is preposterous. That is not in America's interest. I would argue that is not in the world's interest. But it is important that the relationship will change, and Saudi Arabia cannot take for granted, after the life of this administration, that it will continue to receive the same leniency from the United States, historically from Democratic presidents as much as Republican ones. It cannot expect to receive the same leniency in the future. The world has changed. In the past, this is not typical Saudi behavior, but other countries that have done this sort of thing, murdered critics, could have waited for time to heal the wounds. It could have waited for time to sweep the incident under some sort of a metaphorical carpet. The world has changed. Social media will make sure that doesn't happen. The Washington Post clearly is not going to give up on the story. If everything that we're learning about the Bezos case is true, you can bet that the story is not going to go away for a very long time to come. So the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia will remain important for the US and very, very important for the Saudis, but it's not going to be the same. I think there will be a certain standoffish aspect to that relationship, an acknowledgement that they need each other, but they're perhaps not as close friends as they used to be.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes, and there is a microphone. So whoever has the microphone can come here, please.
Hi, I'm Stephanie, the director of Change.org in Italy, and also I'm doing a lot of work on the negotiations in Yemen. And I was wondering if you can say just a couple of words about the intersection of the Khashoggi case and developments in Yemen. It's not exactly a tiny question, but things seem to have stalled a little bit in Yemen, although after his killing, there was sort of an upsurge in interest.
I'll take the second question because it's from Laura Silvia Battaglia, and she's interested in Yemen too, so maybe then we can answer together too.
Thank you. Just want to raise this question here. As people who care about Yemen, it's really heartbreaking to realize that we need a man chopped on a table to talk about 28 million of people who are starving and dying. One of the worst humanitarian crises. And so, just to share this feeling. But we know how politics works, so I have two questions, basically. I just wish to know honestly from you, Washington Post, and maybe if there is someone from New York Times here, how much the Democrats pulled after the death of Jamal Khashoggi to have, again, reports from Yemen, because it was just after that people were paid by New York Times to go there and to report not only from the Saudi side, but also from the northern side. And my other question is how much the lobby of Muslim Brotherhood in US and in the world pushed also for the investigation and also for raising that tension on the Yemeni conflict. Thank you.
Bobby, I think this is for you about Yemen.
I'm not sure it is for me. I'm not based in Washington, so I don't cover American domestic politics. I don't think I can talk to the pressures that were applied. I agree with you that it is shocking and frankly disturbing that it takes the murder of one man in Turkey to draw the world's attention to an ongoing slaughter of innocents in Yemen. Politics certainly has a role to play there, but it's also human nature.
I do remember the last time, one of the, about 2 weeks after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, I was meeting a friend of mine who's a famous Egyptian activist, Wael Ghunaim. And this is what he said, and he was basically trying to console me for the death of our mutual friend. And he said, had Jamal Khashoggi sat at the Washington Post desk and written 10,000 op-eds for another 10 years, he wouldn't have achieved the change in public perspective that his death has achieved. And this is a very small consolation, but it's a fact.
But the change is real. The fact that that Congress has just passed a resolution demanding that the U.S. stop supplying weapons to the Saudi-led alliance, that other countries are doing the same thing, Germany and so on. This is not just a matter of perception. This is not just a matter of optics. Real change is taking place, and it will, I believe, perhaps optimistically, it will bring real change to the ground in Yemen. It's not going to make the Houthis and the Saudis love each other, or the different divisions within Yemen come to terms, but at least it begins to create an atmosphere where that is even possible, whereas a year ago that did not seem possible.
Yeah, I think there's more pressure on Saudi to wrap up the war. What happened to Jamal Khashoggi means that the US political establishment is rethinking its relationship with Saudi Arabia, and so you see a lot of issues like Yemen that were not ignored, but Saudis were giving a free pass for, so the war in Yemen, but also the arrest of, say, the women's rights activists now are becoming bigger priorities in the public discussion on the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I think as Bobby was saying, there's now bipartisan support on that.
Well, Congress really wants to agree on something, and one of the only things that agrees on right now is Saudi Arabia. And this is a problem for Mohammed bin Salman.
Well, I mean, I've been told that our time is finished twice. So thank you very much to all of you for being here, and thanks to our speakers.